Hello, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm the Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies at Daccord University. We're pleased to welcome you back to the rightscity conference. This is day 2. This year, our focus is to have discussions on human rights in the digital age. And we're really pleased on behalf of all our partners to bring together some of the world's top experts on these issues that governments, NGOs, the UN are struggling to wrap their heads around and find solutions. So I just want to say on behalf of my institute and my colleagues, but also the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, the Department for National Defense, the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa, the American Embassy to Canada, the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to Canada, the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes Network, and the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. These are all the partners that came together to help make this happen. I'd like to thank them for supporting this and engaging in a crucial discussion that we need to understand what's happening in the digital world and how it impacts humanitarian operations and the protection of civilians. So I'm very pleased to pass this on to our moderator, Megan Roberts, who's with the UN Foundation, to have a discussion on the case for a digital Geneva Convention, which has been really growing in recent years. So with that to do, I'd like to pass the floor to Megan and ask her to introduce the guest and take the conversation from there.
Thanks so much, Kyle, and thanks so much to all of you tuning in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're tuning in. As Kyle mentioned, I'm Megan Roberts, Director of Policy Planning at the UN Foundation, and I'm delighted to be here today to moderate what I'm sure will be a fascinating and really all too timely conversation as part of rightscity 2021 on the case for a digital Geneva Convention. This idea, as many of you will know, was initially proposed by Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, in 2017. And in his proposal, he wrote, "The time has arrived to call on the world's governments to implement international rules to protect the civilian use of the internet. Just as the Fourth Geneva Convention has long protected civilians in times of war, we now need a digital Geneva Convention that will commit governments to protecting civilians from nation-state attacks in times of peace." Smith's proposal came in 2017 as the world was still reeling from the harms caused by a number of massive cyber attacks, including NotPetya, which was one of, if not the most damaging cyber attack the world has ever seen. And the idea, as Kyle mentioned, of a digital Geneva Convention is really receiving a lot more attention recently as so much of our lives has moved online in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and as we become more dependent on digital than ever. And during this time, we've also seen a surge in cyber attacks against individuals, companies, governments, and even the medical and research facilities working to end the pandemic. Because of time pressure, I won't be able to go through our panelists' extensive and very impressive biographies. So I'll just give a quick introduction of each of our experts. I'm joined today by Stéphane Duguin. Stéphane is the Chief Executive Officer of the Cyber Peace Institute. We're also joined by Yves Daccord. Yves is a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And he was previously, as I mentioned, the Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we're also joined by Anna Beduschi. Anna is an associate professor at the University of Exeter, an associate research fellow at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. So I really appreciate these incredible experts being with us here today. But now I'm really pleased to invite our panelists to take the floor and offer some initial reflections on this proposal for a digital Geneva Convention. So Stéphane, let's start with you.
Thank you very much for inviting us. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me well. Opening remarks, I will keep them short in the sense of what is it that we are trying to solve when we are talking about potential Geneva Convention? What's the issue at stake? I guess to start with, it's a problem of escalation of malicious behavior and the responsibility of states when it comes to this escalation. Interestingly, you may have seen that in the latest draft report for the UN group for government experts, there's a specific mention that the states put together, which is an ambition to reduce the operating space for terrorists and criminals online. And that's a noble ambition. It's the difference in between the theory of the rules of the road and what is the reality of your driving. What is exactly happening today in the cyberspace? And is there any documentation or any measurements of what states are really doing and not doing in order to make sure that cyber peace, that's what we are defending in the Cyber Peace Institute, that cyber peace, meaning a state of play for you and I, everyone, to enjoy security, dignity, and equity in the cyberspace exists. And that's the responsibility of states. So it's about making sure that the system allows for accountability, that all the norms that have been set out for years are implemented, and we can measure how much they implemented. So it's about walking the talk. And that at the end of the day, whatever is decided is not for the sake of states to protect themselves against people, but it's for people to get the necessary protection from states. That would be my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stéphane. Such a helpful landscaping to help us understand, where this proposal sits and how it might respond to some of the security challenges we see online and really what the goal should be. Anna, I'd like to turn to you next.
Thank you. And thank you indeed for the invitation and the opportunity to be discussing this very topical subject with our panelists. I would like to put forward three main observations here. First of all, as Stéphane has mentioned just now, cyber operations do not occur in a legal vacuum, and cyberspace is not a lawless space. It was reaffirmed by the two UN-based processes on responsible behavior of states in cyberspace, the OEWG and the GGE recently, that international law applies to cyberspace. That means that all the established bodies of international law, such as international humanitarian law, international human rights law, apply to cyberspace, and states have obligations arising from these bodies of law. With that in mind, with these two considerations in mind, we will need to see whether there is an appetite amongst states to negotiate and adopt a new treaty, and what would be the consequences for that. So we're seeing at the domestic level at the moment the adoption of binding rules, a movement towards more adoption and calls for adoption of binding rules regarding technology, especially AI, artificial intelligence. And we're seeing also the emergence of norms concerning certain aspects of the use of cyber operations concerning, in particular, critical infrastructure, such as hospitals, for example. So does it mean that we're having a consensus emerging in international level, at the international level, that could lead to the adoption of this treaty? This is something that would need to be considered. And at the same time, what would be the risks there to have a new treaty that could perhaps end up with a less protective treaty than the ones that already exist? So all of these would need to be taken into account, and it's a fascinating topic. I'll stop there and be happy to continue the discussions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Excellent framing remarks and lots to dig in there, including on the existing landscape and how a digital Geneva Convention would interact with what we have in our existing protections and frameworks. I'll turn now to Yves to offer some opening reflections.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be with you. I just wanted to start from the Geneva Convention, in fact, because I've been triggered, of course, and I was quite fascinated by, at the time, the fact that Brad Smith from Microsoft was coming with this idea. And for me, my first reflections was, why? He's coming from the private sectors and using, in fact, somewhat state definitions about an issue that was also challenging, because he also brought the peace notion, right, at the time. So I also thought, first thing is, we see that, in fact, private sectors are more challenged by, in fact, cyber attack, and Stéphane mentioned that, and they, I think, feel also that they are under pressure, and they need not just to think about what they do, but they think about their customer, and they start to realize they might not be in a position to protect the customer. So that I was happy that somebody was talking about the Geneva Conventions. My point too is related to my own experience. I've worked quite some years at the ICSC, and I'm somebody who believes deeply that the Geneva Convention works. And I just would like to make a connection between our Geneva Convention right now. Of course, there is a lot of tensions. Of course, their interpretation in the field sometimes is difficult. Of course, they are related in Yemen, in Syria, in Ukraine, in Somalia. But at the same time, they are our common grammar. They really unite us in the understanding of what are we talking about. And I think we should never, ever forget how important it is in terms of clarify what it means. What are we talking when we talk about protection? What are we talking when we talk about civilian? What are we talking about when we talk about proportionality? All that is absolutely critical. I think the point too is for me is we need to unpack the issue. We can't just go at the global level, at the global framework. That sounds extremely difficult. And we need to unpack the issue in order to be specific about what issues are we trying to resolve. And last but not least, I think our compass really should be about the people, as always. But it's good to remember that we are not just trying now to manage, in fact, power dynamic between states, as a lot of people have talked these days with this Biden-Putin discussions, for example, also the last decision of NATO. No, it's not about that. If we're serious, and this is what we're discussing right now, it's about protecting, in fact, the people affected by war, affected by cyber attack, and how do we do that? I think that should really guide us and should help us to be very concrete about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yves, and a number of just really important points to have front and center in this conversation. Particularly your last one around putting people at the center, putting civilians and individuals at the center. I'm going to take advantage of moderator's privilege and ask our panelists a few questions, but we're really eager to make this an interactive conversation. So please, start entering your questions in the chat box, and we'll work to get as many of them as we can in the hour. But while we wait for those questions to come rolling in, Stéphane, I want to turn to you first with a question about the risk landscape. You talked about this in your opening remarks, but the Cyber Peace Institute works to advance peace and justice in cyberspace. Can you talk a bit about some of the recent trends your organization is seeing, and expectations and sort of forecast looking ahead? What do you see as the most pressing cyber challenges, and what are the vulnerabilities that really keep you and your colleagues awake at night?
Well, thank you. To give a bit of context there, so Cyber Peace Institute has been set up quite recently at the end of 2019, and in fact it was in a direct follow-up of Brad Smith's call for Digital Geneva Convention, and the Institute has been set up to be independent and neutral in Geneva to document and measure attacks, what is happening to people. Our interest is what is happening to people, the societal impact of attacks, but then putting these attacks in the context of what is the ecosystem of norms and law in which these attacks are happening. That's very important to always link the two, because what we want to do is that for the victims or the targets of attack, to really have the information to obtain redress, to obtain repair, and to obtain justice. Otherwise, we're just talking about it, and it's very difficult to do anything. So practically speaking, what we did is to focus on what was happening in the healthcare. And to answer your question, I think it's good to look into the trends of healthcare for the past year. So in the context of a pandemic, when this critical infrastructure was, I don't need to explain why, needed by everyone in the world, there's been a rise in attack. At the peak of the pandemic, I was mentioning this earlier, we could document one attack per day in March 2020, and all type of attacks. And that's why it's important when you map the landscape, is to understand that from the victim point of view, it's not really important who is attacking you. What is important is that you're under attack. It can be a criminal group, it can be a state-sponsored actor, it can be a state actor, it can be a blend of disinformation in between a criminal group that is working for a state. I mean, it's at the end of the day, you're impacted.
Thanks so much, Stéphane. That's incredibly helpful. I mean, the surge in 45% surge in ransomware attacks against healthcare facilities, against 20% of surge of attacks more broadly is really striking. And your point about the very fast, this threat landscape evolving very quickly is an important one for us to keep in mind, especially against the long-term process of establishing, new laws, new treaties, and new conventions. What elements would the Digital Geneva Convention entail in terms of the development and deployment of cyber operations by nation states? And are there other, we talked about this a little bit already, but, can you speak more about other established norms and conventions that might influence the content of the convention, and just the regulation more broadly of cyberspace?
That's an excellent question. And here, I believe we need to distinguish between two scenarios. So we have the development and the deployment of cyber capabilities in the context of an armed conflict or with a view of using during armed conflict. And here we would have the international humanitarian law that would apply, and there are a number of specific rules that would be quite helpful on that, including Article 36 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Convention. However, as Stéphane was saying a while ago, the majority of the situations in which we would have cyber operations and cyber attacks, they may occur outside of an armed conflict, so in peacetime. And here, there is a variety of international rules and norms that may apply. And I believe that too much of this debate since 2017-18 has been held too much in the context of this military or IHL, so international humanitarian law, uses of that. And so here, I think we need to be careful and think about all of these interactions and the need for whether there is a need for a new convention in this regard, or whether we could be operating with the existing frameworks and go more and deeper into these questions of transparency and accountability. But we could have already existing law and existing norms for that and existing processes. So I think that would be quite interesting to verify.
Thank you, Anna, and all incredibly important points. And then just to expand the aperture, even more, and to build, Yves, on some of your comments earlier, I'd like to push a little bit further on some of the humanitarian implications. So as former Director General of ICRC, what would a digital Geneva Convention potentially mean for humanitarian action, and how would it relate to existing civilian protections? And just more broadly, how do you think about and how would you define matters of humanitarian protection in the digital age?
I was just saying I'm a little bit struck with Anna's comment, and she's right. I think one of the issues since 2017, when Brad Smith launched the idea of the convention, it's true. He let's say expanded. He said this in peacetime. Of course, the Geneva Conventions are related first and foremost to with conflict area, and I think there is always this difficulty somewhat to be able to navigate between the two. But let's say if we talk about if we would have something like that, and I'm not sure we need to have a Geneva Convention, and I mentioned, but let's imagine that we would agree, and state we would agree that we have a global framework and somewhat we are moving in that directions. It would change a lot of things. I think the first thing in terms of humanitarian organization, it change at least two things. The first one is it will really change. It is already the case, but it will be a confirmation that the needs, what we call humanitarian needs, are shifting, are changing. You will still have to deal a lot with classical humanitarian needs related to health, to water, to physical protection for people, migration. We've seen over the last, let's say, 5 years, really a booming in terms of protection, data protections, regulation and reflections around that. But then the humanitarian sectors will have to really completely, I would say, do a paradigm shift around that, much more than it is already today.
Thank you so much. We're almost at the hour, and I know there's an incredible next panel that will start right at 1 p.m. So unfortunately, we have to close out our conversation, and I won't try to sum up such a nuanced conversation in 30 seconds. I have dozens more questions that I'd love to ask our panelists. But I really appreciate some of these concrete ideas around how we can be fostering multi-stakeholder conversations. What are some of the practical ways and actions that different sectors can act on this challenge now, even if a treaty might seem a little bit out of reach in this moment. I want to thank our panelists who offered such thoughtful and rich remarks and gave us a lot to consider. And I want to thank all of you who tuned in and gave us such great questions and Really appreciate your time and hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Megan, for doing an amazing job moderating that fascinating discussion about a digital Geneva Convention. I'm going to rewatch it later today just to get my head around it. It's complex, but it's so fascinating. And I want to thank Stéphane, Yves, and Anna. Thanks for joining us from Geneva. I know it was kind of early evening for you, but thank you. We really appreciate you taking your time.